Hey, welcome to our live interview with some of the contributors and editors of our very first release of the new year, People Get Ready 12 Jesus Haunted Misfits, Malcontents, and Dreamers in Pursuit of Justice. As you can probably tell from the title, this book is loaded with powerful essays about 20th century activists that you've likely heard of, maybe some you haven't, and who've made a major impact in pursuit of justice for the marginalized. I get to introduce you to a conversation with some of the incredible contributors as they discuss the importance of this book for us today, why they felt like it was a notable project to be a part of, and what you can expect to see between the pages. People Get Ready releases next Tuesday, but of course, you can pre-order it today, and we'll put all of the links and everything you need in the chat below. Without further ado, I will pass it off to Peter Slade.
Hi, I am Peter Slade, and I'm one of the co-editors of this book and was part of pulling the team together. I teach at Ashland University in Ohio, and part of the team. I'll hand off to Shea, and she can tell you who she is.
Great. I'm Shea Tuttle. I am also one of the co-editors of this project. I do a couple things. I do some writing, and I also work at a nonprofit health clinic that serves uninsured and Medicaid patients in Richmond, Virginia. And yeah, I'm glad to be here. I was part of this book, and then I was also an editor on Can I Get a Witness, which we may reference tonight, but I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Jacqueline Bussie, and I'm the executive director of the Collegeville Institute, which is in Collegeville, Minnesota, and we empower writers who are writing about faith and life. And I wanted to be a part of this project because I love the project on lived theology, and I believe that theology should always be lived. So excited to be here and happy for the conversation.
Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Jemar Tisby. I'm an author, a historian, and starting Monday, a professor at Simmons College of Kentucky in Louisville. I was intrigued and excited by this project, but I also didn't have a choice. Peter Slade said he would text me every hour on the hour till I said yes. But then thankfully I met Shea and Jacqueline, and I was like, oh, there's cool people here, so we can do it. No, in all honesty, it was my pleasure. What drew me to the project was really the contributors and getting to know them, learning about the figures they studied through their perspectives has been a really rich and enjoyable experience.
So this book, People Get Ready, is kind of a second volume. As Shea mentioned, she was, and I was part of a project called Can I Get a Witness, which is also published by Eerdmans. And this is a kind of sequel, but it's also a development. So Shea, could you say something about, so the book, right? The book is a collection of research-enriched kind of theological narratives. Could you say a bit about kind of the project and how the idea of pulling all these narratives together and how we wound up with this second volume?
Yeah. So both of these books come out of the Project on Lived Theology at the University of Virginia, which is a research project that kind of looks at the connections between sort of faith and life, but what that often looks like is a study of people who've worked for justice. The project is also a place where there's a lot of interest in writing well about those kinds of things so that these stories can be shared with the widest possible audience. So I used to work at the Project on Lived Theology. I was there when we did Can I Get a Witness? And the Can I Get a Witness project, it's as Pete said, a very similar book. It has 13 narratives. They're all theological, biographical narratives. And the people who are in that book represent many different kind of areas of interest. We tried to make the sort of cast of characters as diverse as we possibly could. And they're all people who worked for social change in the United States in about the last 100 years, and they did that somewhat on the basis of their faith convictions. And so it was a fascinating project. We had such a good time pulling those narratives together. And as Pete said, using research to enrich these narratives, but also working to make the narratives compelling and to make them strong writing. And what we found really was that there were just way too many people that we wanted to write about. And way too few pages in that book. So after that set of 13, we decided we needed to do some more. So then we started the process of thinking about another volume and who we might want to include, both in terms of the characters to profile, but also the people we wanted to write those narratives. And Pete was part of that process. So do you want to pick that up there?
Yeah, so it was at the end of 2018, right as the year was changing to 2019, and I was working with Charles Marsh, who's the director of the Project Unlived Theology, and we knew that we didn't know what was coming in the future, but we knew that times would be challenging. And as we're recording this, Jemar just pointed out that today is January the 6th. This is kind of an anniversary that reminds us of how tricky times became. So we wanted to have a book that would help equip the saints with examples of what it meant to stand up for justice and to seek justice. And I was presented with this really long spreadsheet of everyone under the sun of possible people, and it was quite late in the evening, and my memory is that Charles Marsh locked the door, but maybe he didn't, and said, we're not leaving here until we've got down to 12 people we want in this book and 12 people we want to write about them. So it was a scientific process. We wanted to have a real range of characters. We wanted to have, and we'll talk more about this, this isn't a hagiography. This wasn't about beautiful saintly people who were beautiful and saintly, that would just demoralize the reader, right? Because we can't be like that. But that we wanted people who were Jesus haunted, people who felt that times were not right and they had to do something about it, but it's messy and people's lives are messy. And then we also wanted to have a real range that addressed kind of a range of issues that we knew we were facing at the time. So we really wanted to have stuff, people who addressed injustice with immigration on the southern border and elsewhere. We wanted to address issues of environmentalism as well as racism, and then you like, well, who else? Who's our dream team to write about these people? And so it wasn't entirely scientific. We had to have a good doctrine of providence, I think, to see who wound up. But I'm delighted to say that we ended up with a really interesting cast of characters and a wonderful group of people writing about them. Does someone else want to say something about what you think people will get out of this book when they're reading it?
I'll jump in here, Pete, and say just one thing I think hasn't been said, which is one of the things that was really compelling for me about the project was that we were asked to write theological biographies. I remember that we were saying that was the genre, and that's a very unusual genre. At first I was like, what even is that? And so I think there's characters in the book that we're writing about, these amazing people, but we're writing about them in a different way than other people may have seen before. So a lot of people write about Toni Morrison's literature, right? But what about her life? Like, what about how her faith drove her to write the things that she wrote and act in the way that she acted? So I think that is especially unique about the book, is that we actually look at those folks' lives, and they're ordinary people, and they have failings, they have limitations, and they have all these strengths as well. And so I think that's the real gift of the book, is that you see not only the continuity of the challenges that have faced us over time, but that historical retrieval of how these amazing individuals, how they actually did something rather than just sit on their hands and feel despair. So I think that's very powerful.
So the three of us here write, most of the stuff we write is academic, or has been, and our training is academic writing. And a lot of the work, we gathered the authors together, the contributors together, and we workshopped how we were going to write these narratives. And Shea, could you say something about that sort of challenge of teaching academics to write good stories?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's been something really interesting over over the years that I worked at the project, that we were regularly asking academics to write sort of to write creatively, to write for an audience larger than they might have just in their classrooms or in academic journals. But at some point we sort of realized, just because you ask someone to do that and just because they want to do that doesn't mean that they know how to do that. And so we really dug in both of these books, we dug into trying to think through, how do we do that? So we tried to borrow from creative writing worlds and from creative writing genres. We looked at, what can we learn from writers of fiction? What can we learn from writers of memoir? But then also kind of what are, I borrowed notes from a lecture in a creative writing program to sort of go through in a workshop with our contributors to this book to say, this is what creative writers might be thinking about as they construct a scene, because as an academic writer, you might not have tried to construct a scene before. And so we did some of that work together. We structured, with this book, we structured 3 different writing groups led by the 3 different editors. And so that those sets of writers got to sort of contribute to each other and get feedback from each other, and then get feedback from their editor on the writing itself. And we went through more drafts than most academic writing processes do, which may have been frustrating for some of our writers, but more revision and more kind of, trying to really strengthen the storytelling in these narratives so that they're fun to read as well as, helpful for living and for justice work. So that was it's always a challenge. I mean, writing's always a challenge, but I think it was a good one.
So when we were matching people with characters on this spreadsheet, some people were just like, real examples. So Mallory McDuff, who writes on environmental issues, we thought she'd be great to write about Rachel Carson. She'd not researched Rachel Carson. That was a new project for her. And she came up with a wonderful chapter. Other people on the list I knew had actually done academic work on these characters and sort of wanted to let them loose in maybe writing about them in a different way. And that's true of you, right, Jemar? I knew that you'd studied Tom Skinner. Could you say a bit about who Tom Skinner is and what that process was like? So you'd written about him, or you were writing about him in your dissertation, right? Your
That's
PhD
right.
dissertation, and then you're writing this different kind of thing.
Well, it was a great excuse, this group, to actually sit down and do some more research and do some more writing. All apologies to particularly Peter Slade, who was the leader in my group, and all of the hounding he had to do, chasing me down to get him the material. But it was a really wonderful exercise. One of the things that sticks out to me about this is it wasn't just a bunch of writers in their own spaces doing their own things, and then we just did the whole thing over email or something. We actually got together. And Shea, you led a really wonderful session that even I remember with my horrible memory about how to craft a compelling story. And that really stuck with me. But then also the time we got to spend together, learning a little bit about each other's stories, research interests, and then going around and talking about each of our individual historical figures, some of whom I'd never heard of, some of whom I'd heard of but wasn't familiar with from this angle or perspective. So that's what I really appreciated about it. It was a collaborative project. It was an embodied kind of project, lived theology, as we've talked about before. My historical figure is a man named Tom Skinner, who is a Black evangelical who was very well known in those circles in the 1960s and 70s, especially. Tom Skinner, if anybody's heard of him, it's probably for a speech he gave at Urbana in 1970. And that, as a matter of fact, as we record this, Urbana just wrapped up. And so it's still going. But he gave a speech called the U.S. Racial Crisis and World Evangelism, but it's better known as The Liberator Has Come. That is the last line of this really rousing speech where 11,000 students at this missions conference rose up almost as one in a standing ovation and really celebrated his way of blending Black racial concerns and current context with evangelical theology and messages. But not everyone was a fan. So after that speech in particular, he got angry letters. He had a radio program on Moody Radio that he was booted off of shortly thereafter for being, quote, too political. And what drew me to Skinner was things like that. I've been called being too political in white evangelical spaces in particular. And so much of what Skinner was trying to do, raising these racial concerns to a predominantly white audience that fancied themselves as colorblind and open-minded by and large, and he's really confronting them with, hey, no, this is the reality and y'all aren't doing enough, and all kinds of trouble that got him into. So my chapter was a little bit different in that I wove my own story into the chapter because the intersection was so organic, and hopefully that resonates with the reader and helps them be drawn to this historical figure.
That's great. And I just sort of want to lift that up too, as one of the ways that I think this book and the writing style can differ from so much academic writing, is I think every writer, as they worked on their chapter, had to think about, do I belong in this chapter? And if so, in what way? And how do I do that in a way that, has integrity with the subject that I'm writing about, which I think, your chapter did so well, Jemar. But I think that, that's an interesting part of this book and this process too, is that you get some of those, some of the writers end up on the page, not all of them, but some of them do. And that can really enrich the storytelling as well, I think.
Jemar, you got very involved. I mean, sort of interlaced really in your chapter, and figuring out some that you're sort of in conversation with Tom Skinner, really, I think, in that chapter. And I sense that you wish that you really could be in conversation with him to share experiences and share wisdom. Jacqueline, you were also sort of in conversation with your. Say a bit about you, because your chapter's wild. That was quite a roller coaster.
It was quite a roller coaster, absolutely. So I'm an editor and a contributor, right? So my chapter is actually on Flannery O'Connor, who was somebody that I'd never researched, right? But I had read, all of her short stories or novels when I was in school. So I thought, oh, that would be interesting. But I didn't actually know that much about her life. She's a Southern Catholic writer, and writes a lot about the grotesque, has a very grotesque style. And so some very interesting things happened. So I started doing my research, actually researching her life. And while I was doing that, her literary estate, which was guarded and protected to the highest levels, like CIA files, some of them got released to the public for the very first time since her death. And while I was writing. And so I was able to read some of those. And I was horrified by what they said. They were completely racist. I found out that in her book of letters that called The Habit of Being, that most people have read, that it was highly edited and all of her racist comments were edited out, and that she used the N-word in regular conversations. I found out that she refused to meet with James Baldwin. I'm just going to say that again. She refused to meet with James Baldwin. And, she was well known for her home in Milledgeville welcoming anyone who was coming through. But she said no to the invitation to meet with James Baldwin. She criticized Muhammad Ali. She criticized Martin Luther King. I mean, it was awful. And I came to the group when Jemar mentioned that we all got together. And I actually said, I think I have to withdraw as a contributor, because I don't like my person anymore. I don't want, there's nothing here. What am I supposed to retrieve? She's a racist. It's awful. And she's known for her literature being what seems to be ostensibly very anti-racist, right? She has these satirical, scathing critiques of people who are racist. And it was that literature that I'd loved, but then her life didn't add up. And I thought, what am I supposed to do with this? And somebody in our room, it was Lauren Winter, she's a contributor as well. She was like, I think then that you should write about that. Write about the truth, that you were like, I don't think I can do this. So my piece, I'm very much on the page because I had to be, and I had to say, I used to love Flannery O'Connor. In the writing of this chapter, I fell out of love with Flannery O'Connor, and then I fell back in love with her, but for a completely different reason, because I was able to see the way in which she transcended her own prejudice. And I found this prayer journal of hers that also was very recently released. It was private, it was never meant to be published, in which she talked about that she would say, like, please, God, give me a story. And she shared that when she was writing, she would write things that she felt came to her completely from elsewhere. And when you read about who she is as a person, you're like, yeah, that's, your stories are not coming from you, because like you yourself carry all these biases and white privilege and prejudice, you know, but you're showing up for the page and you're allowing something to happen that transcends you. And she talks about like having in her mind, like her mind is little boxes. And I'm like, yeah, white privilege is one of those boxes. And her writing actually transcends it. And so I found this way in which to say, I love her for a different reason. I love her that she showed up and she allowed grace to happen just by actually showing up for the page. And she's also super honest in her writing that she isn't actually the author of her stories, which is very mystical and weird, and we can do whatever we want with it. But I think it's time that we actually take her seriously, that she is saying that she is not the author of what she wrote in her literature. And that would explain a lot of why it's actually better than who she was. So I found that to be incredibly, incredibly fascinating.
I really, really appreciate your honest sort of transparency and candor in that chapter. I had a similar conflict, if you will, or at least a tension with Tom Skinner. I talked about his speech at Urbana, which was, I mean, for that circle, mostly white evangelicals, pretty radical, actually. But my question was, you know, whither the radicalism of Tom Skinner, where did it go? Did it persist? Because in subsequent years, you find much less evidence of him sort of taking a similar speak truth to power kind of tack in those circles. And so I wrestled with, did that go somewhere? Did it work in terms of them trying to intimidate him or silence him in some way? Did he get tired and feel like it wasn't worth it? It left me with more questions than answers. It left me with a deep respect for somebody who contributed what he did. And I had to confront myself as a student of Skinner, where I'm looking for a roadmap that I thought would lead to a certain destination, and maybe it didn't. But what does that diminish the person? What can I still learn, even if it is unexpected and in some senses disappointing? And I still have those questions, but I was grateful for the opportunity to be able to begin to search them out on the page. So I really appreciate from the editors the liberty and the freedom to explore those tensions with our historical subjects.
I think that, I mean, this really shows how, if you're in a book group, these are very manageable sized chapters, and they raise questions. They prompt discussion. Really, like we've already said, some people you'll have heard about. Other people they weren't well known at the time when they were active. We also had to. It's a wild challenge to write a short chapter on somebody's whole life. In fact, it's impossible. You can't do it, obviously. So part of the process was all of us kind of finding, what's the story? What is the story that we want to tell? Or none of us claim to be like Flannery O'Connor in our writing, but what is being open to the story that comes to us? Ansley Quiros wrote about Florence Jordan, who was part of Koinonia Farm, and she ended up focusing on just constructing one day in this woman's life as a way of telling her story. I ended up with Pete Seeger as a character. That's totally my own fault. I gave him to myself because as a kid I remember listening to his records, and I didn't really think about that one before I said yes. So there were two challenges. One is he lived an incredibly long time and did an awful lot of stuff. So that makes it writing about a character hard. And then the other thing that I really didn't think through before I accepted was he was explicitly not a Christian. he was a communist, and he was very clear about what he thought about Christianity. So I had to look around for his story, and he really features as somebody who's Jesus haunted, very much so. And I the place I came into the story with him was I tell the story of his involvement, and he wasn't a leader of, but he was involved in the march from Selma to Montgomery, which is obviously a very famous event and very topical as we're thinking about voting rights. But the reason I chose him was he gave Pete Seeger addressed a bunch of students in a baccalaureate address shortly after the march from Selma to Montgomery, and he said this. He said, "I believe that in the period of history we're entering, it's going to be very difficult to love a large portion of the human race living here in the USA." And in 2019, I was really concerned at just the incredible fragmentation and polarization we were seeing going on in our country and our churches, and how hard it was, the loss of empathy that everyone was feeling. Just could not understand how those people, whoever those people were, for those people, you just couldn't understand them, hard to love them. And then he said, and then Pete Seeger, the avowed communist, not Christian person, said, "If we're in for a struggle to keep our country from falling into bad ways, don't think it need be a joyless struggle. Far from it. As Jesus urged his disciples, be of good cheer." And it just struck me, this guy can preach, and he's got a good understanding of scripture. He knows the whole quote that he's pulling from, "Be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." And so I wanted to learn what this guy saw on the march from Selma to Montgomery that gave him that kind of hope, that Jesus hope. So that's what I explore in my chapter. And it's not, Pete Seeger didn't like have a road to Damascus experience and he didn't walk the aisle and become a Christian preacher, but I think there's a huge amount we can learn from people like him.
Can I comment for a second on something Jemar said?
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to come back to Jemar's chapter because I think that it's amazing. And I think that it's very important, for readers of this book because really when we think about, it makes me think about cancel culture. So while I was writing my chapter, it actually happened that Flannery O'Connor got canceled by Loyola University in Maryland. The students of color started a petition. They were like, "Why is our dorm named after Flannery O'Connor?" When these letters were coming out, they were like, "We want it to be changed." And so it was changed. But that made me think about what Jemar was saying about Tom Skinner, right? That it's a both and. We can look to those that we respect, our mentors, those from the past, our clergy, and we can say, "This is an incredible thing that you did." And then we can also push them further the way that Jemar does and ask more questions and say, so I love the both and way of thinking because these are theological pieces. When you were looking at anyone's life, people are sinful. It's just a fact. Right? So what does that say to us about cancel culture? What does it say about historical retrieval? When we go back to our mentors and to people, to our ancestors, and we want to be able to say, what should I be doing in this very difficult situation today? I just love Jemar's approach, right? Mm-hmm. That there's so much that we can say, yes. And then there's so much we can say, I have serious questions about this. And I think the more we can be candid about that, the better. And I think that's one of the things that the book shows us how to do.
It's a really humbling stewardship because, you mentioned some of Flannery O'Connor's writings that were never meant to be published, right? And I just so that her private thoughts and her honest thoughts, which is illuminating, but also like if folks read our DMs and tweets and journal articles, yeah, and somebody's trying to write a chapter on our lives, that's going to be interesting, which is not to excuse. I'm not on that tip at all, but it is a very humbling exercise. And to one of the points that you made, Peter, just about the variety of styles, and Shea, you mentioned this too, I also think that makes it really, really readable. So there's absolutely a unity and coherence to the book, but it's also one that you can just pick up and read a chapter at a time. And it's one that is going to draw fresh sort of reactions from you because it is different stylistically, although cohesive. And I think that with this many figures who are so different, I mean, this is probably almost 100% chance the first time this particular assemblage of people has been written about between one set of book covers. Because those stories are all so different, I think we can, as readers, find ourselves in them, at least with one person, and more likely with each person in a different way. So it becomes a book that reads you, which I'll be intrigued to hear people's reactions as they pick it up.
I'm wondering if there are any other. I'm looking at my list of contributors and characters. I'm wondering if there are any other chapters we might just want to mention so that folks kind of know what's here. We've touched on a lot of them, but now I feel like I'm picking favorites or something, which I'm not. But I think I just want to.
What are your favorites, Shea?
Yeah, right. Well, number one. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I think I'd like to mention a couple. One, I think Jacqueline mentioned that Lauren Winner. Sorry, somebody mentioned that Lauren Winner was a contributor to the book. And Lauren wrote about Sarah Patton Boyle, who was someone I didn't know anything about. I don't know if the rest of y'all did, but what I really love about her chapter is really, well, a lot, because she's a beautiful writer. She's Lauren Winner, but the way that she sort of takes this character who I had never heard of and is so able to bring her to life, but also that the character is kind of, she's trying to do what she can in these very quiet ways. I mean, she basically tries to change the world by writing 1 million letters to the editor. And it's just maybe too kind of as a writer, I'm attracted to this idea of someone who's just like, this is how I'm going to do my, work. And like all the characters in here, she does that imperfectly, and Lauren names some of the places that she fell short and some of the ways that she learned. But I think that's a really lovely chapter for lots of reasons, but including kind of lifting up a quiet story. And then I also want to mention Carolyn DuPont's chapter on Bruce Clunder. Similarly, a story that very, very few people know, but some of what Carolyn does that I think is really smart is she talks about why we don't know that story and how that story, Bruce Clunder was killed while protesting against a school that would be segregated, that was going to be built. And she names how his story doesn't fit the kinds of narratives that we like to tell and that we expect to hear about race and racism. So, for instance, it takes place in Cleveland, Ohio. And, we like our stories of racism to happen in the South where there's like real racism, right? So like it breaks that kind of the sort of trope of the typical stories that we tell. Also, she names that it was, we like stories to have a really clear enemy of like, obviously bigoted, evil white folks. And these were like white parents of school children. And like, people that it's a little harder for us to say, no, that's what the enemy is supposed to look like in these stories. And then she also names that like this protest was a failure. So like his death did not mean that this thing that shouldn't have happened was stopped. It still went forward. And so she does a really nice job of saying, here are the stories we like to tell. And this is a story that breaks a bunch of those rules. And that's precisely why we need to remember it. So those are a couple that I would lift up, even though there's so many beautiful ones. Those are just a couple that come to mind. And I don't know, those were both writers that I worked with. So I don't know if Pete and Jacqueline, if you have some you'd like to name just so people know it's in there, or Jemar, obviously you're welcome to name more too. So.
Sure. I mean, I can jump in and definitely mention Jane Hong's chapter on Mary Pei-Klee. That was embarrassingly not someone that I knew anything about. And in reality, she was one of the very first Korean immigrants to the United States. And she was a person of faith. She was a Christian, and she wrote a memoir. And Jane's piece is very moving because she talks about how, growing up as a Korean American, she didn't see herself in history, right? In the history that she was presented with her education. And then she read Mary Pei-Klee, and she's like, the history's there. We're just not teaching it. And during the course of Jane writing that chapter, COVID breaks out, and anti-Asian American bias is everywhere. And so her chapter takes on a new relevance, and you see the deep, unfortunate rootedness in American history of anti-Asian American sentiment, and that it's always been there from the first Korean immigrant saying, why are you doing this to me? Continue on to today, which Jane really, I think, expresses so beautifully in her chapter. So
I think that's really interesting, the way that if you're writing truthfully about something, that it suddenly becomes relevant in new ways that you hadn't anticipated when you started, right? So I already mentioned Mallory McDuff's chapter on Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson is very well known, wrote the book Silent Spring, really kicked off the modern environmentalist movement in many ways. But what Mallory did was sort of get to the heart of her spirituality, that kind of inspired her, and she found that this move from that really Rachel Carson was a very anxious person, and the sort of harnessing this anxiety, harnessing this worry, and moving to wonder, and being able to communicate that. This was before the pandemic shutdown, in which the point at which anxiety became the sort of second pandemic, right? And so her chapter for me became even more beautiful as a result of stuff that was going on even after it was started. Yeah, we like this book. We think you will too.
Yeah, sorry to keep going, but I also just want to mention Daniel Rhodes' chapter on Jack Egan, and I'll just say very briefly about that. I just love the setup of that chapter, which is that that Father Jack Egan was a priest who basically got in trouble, I think, for like being too political, like Jemar was mentioning earlier, and so his bishop, as a punishment, sent him to the south side of Chicago, where Father Jack got busy making space for community organizing to happen at his parish, and it transformed the neighborhood, and it certainly transformed Jack Egan as a priest. So that's another really great story. There's just a lot of them in here. So, yeah.
And I'll add briefly, I think this book is right on time. My instinct is that after so many years, however far back you want to count, we've been in times of tension and struggle, and we still are, especially after 2020 with the pandemic, as well as the racial justice uprisings. We put so much energy into trying to do the right thing and moving toward positive change. And it seems that not only did what we hoped not come about, but there was a backlash that actually in some ways pushed us backward. And it can be very discouraging in moments like these. You can ask yourself, is there any hope? Is change possible? Do I have the energy, the persistence, the resilience to go on? And what these stories in People Get Ready do is remind us that there are people who came before us who were struggling with similar issues, different times and contexts, but a similar human struggle, who somehow found a way to contribute to the world, art and beauty and activism. Many of them are people of faith, and even if they're not, they're Jesus haunted. And so I think it is inspiring and motivating and perhaps encouraging for us to read stories of the lives of people who came before us and found the strength to take one more step. And I hope that that's a balm to people's souls right now. I hope that this is inspirational, because these aren't just made up stories. They're not fantasy characters, which can be fun. I love those books. But it is a helpful reminder to read about real people struggling in real ways, many of which we can relate to, and know that there is life and hope and joy in the world.
Well, amen.
Amen.
Amen to that. Well, thank you to everyone for tuning in. We hope this has interested you in the book. Maybe just some of the ideas we've been batting around you've found challenging or inspirational. So if you're so moved, please buy yourself and everybody you know a copy of People Get Ready. It comes out on January the 10th, same time as Prince Harry's book. But, you know, I feel sorry for him that he won't be dominating the book sales in quite the way he had hoped. So you can order a book. There's a link in the chat below this video for you, and also be sure to subscribe to Eerdmans' YouTube channel to get more updates about live streams like this. Check out the project on Lived Theology at their website on livedtheology.org, and subscribe to the emails from Eerdmans. Thank you very much for tuning in. Enjoy reading the book.